It's that time again. Hello everyone and welcome to Guild Wars 2 Daily. Today we're going to be talking about lore, and there's a new person sending in footage for today. Today it's DMOsification. I have no idea how you're supposed to say that, but this person was playing some PvP labelled Skilled Elementalist PvP, so it's actually pretty good videos. That will be what's going on in the background, probably just for this video, and then we'll move on to the next person. But yeah, I've got 3 questions here for lore. I'm going to try and not rant for too long as I keep doing, and yeah, let's just get started. So the first one was from someone called Ravensaurus, who said, in prophecies, it seemed that a lot of NPCs had those flaming swords Rurik and Adalbern have. Are their swords special, or after the destruction of Ascalon, are they the only 2 that remain? This is quite a good question because it's kind of up in the air at the moment, and they did something weird with the Hall of Monuments rewards that throws this into question. So first, the story itself, for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Ascalon really had 2 big catastrophes, 2 things that marked humanity's defeat at the hands of the Char there. The first was something called the Searing, which was where the Char got their hands on a very powerful artifact that was hinted to be from one of the Elder Dragons in some way that they'd acquired. It wasn't necessarily given to them by that dragon, but it certainly seems to have been created or be tapping into a dragon's power. This thing, the Searing, was essentially what the Char used to take Ascalonians off guard and destroy their wall and most of their towns and turn their rivers and lakes into streams of tar and burn everything green away from Ascalon. And that kind of was the start. That was the first big catastrophe. That happens during Guild Wars prophecies, right? Then after the event of Guild Wars 1, a few years after, this isn't an event we actually saw in game, something else happened. This was called the Faux Fire. Ascalon, since the Searing, since this first big catastrophe, had slowly been losing the battle. It had been driven further and further back, and eventually it reached a point where the King Adalbern, decided that there was no victory. But he didn't want to see the Char defile the lands of his capital. He didn't want to see them in Ascalon City. So what he did was invoke this ancient ritual, which in the end damned the whole nation. What it did over a huge radius was kill all Char and humans alike in the area. The Char that died just died, and that was it. More Char would eventually come back into the land, so what Adalbern did was essentially futile because more Char just came in and there were no humans to stop them. But the humans that died there were transformed into ghosts. The Char, to this day in Guild Wars 2, 250 years later, or about 200 years later I suppose, still haven't been able to get rid of. So there are areas of Ascalon, even though the Char have conquered it, the ghosts still reign over and the Char don't exactly have access to. And really, these are the areas closest to where Adalbern invoked this ritual. This thing was called the Faux Fire, as I said. And really, after that, humanity was just gone from Ascalon. There was one last real outpost of human resistance at a place called Ebenhawk, far to the south. And that's where they essentially waged their war from for the next 250 years until the treaty was enacted just before the game starts. So that's kind of the history there. But this thing, the Faux Fire, this second great catastrophe, was invoked through swords. Now, Adalbern had a sword called Magdea, and his son Rurik, who had died a long time before Adalbern decided to do this, had another sword called Sohothin. Now, we don't know the full story about where these swords came from, but we know that they are magical swords that have got some significance. The ritual that Adalbern invoked with these ghosts, that made these ghosts that will never go away, it is said that the power from that, where all of the energy for that came from, seems to have been from Adalbern's sword. It seems to have come from Magdea. Now, there is a legend that says when Magdea and its twin sword Sohothin, which Rurik owned, when they are brought back together, that could end the ghost threat and it could undo the effects of the Faux Fire. And this was all stuff we learnt about in a big article called The Movement of the World that was released at the end of Guild Wars 1's lifespan, as they introduced us to the lore of Guild Wars 2. Now, the last we'd heard of Rurik and this other sword, Sohothin, it was in a place called the Fire Island Chain, a long way away from Ascalon. And it seemed to a lot of us that this was kind of ArenaNet setting up a reason for us, the players, to have to go back to the Fire Island Chain, which is essentially this desolate area that nothing is really alive on. Rurik had died there through circumstance that is kind of spoilish for the plot of Guild Wars 1, so I won't go into that too much. But this sword was all the way over there. We thought that the story was going to be that was our reason to go go back to the Fire Island chain. However, later we learned that Ritlock, the iconic character for the Char players, has somehow got his hand on Rurik's sword, and we have no idea how he got his hand on it. So that's one big gaping hole in the story. But the other gaping hole is what you're asking here about these two swords that look like flaming swords. Now, in Guild Wars 1, if you walked up to Rurik while he was alive in the game, or Adalbern while he's got his sword equipped, you can see that the swords they've got are these fiery swords, but these fiery swords, loads of NPCs had. Tons and tons of the Ascalonian army seem to have them, and they would drop in an awful lot of places in Guild Wars. They were a very rare drop, but they would drop in many places of the world. They were called fiery dragon swords, and as far as Guild Wars 1's concerned, there was no difference between the fiery dragon swords that Rurik and Adalbern had and the fiery dragon swords that everyone else seemed to have, including the players. Then now with Guild Wars 2 lore, they've established that these two swords are slightly different. I guess one way to look at it would be just to say that the fact lots of other players and characters had those swords in Guild Wars 1, that just kind of wasn't canon. Because now in Guild Wars 2, you can look, and no characters have got fiery dragon swords. They're literally nowhere. Only Ritlock has got his fiery sword, and when you do the Ascalonian Catacombs, you can also see the other swords. So there is this aspect to it that you could say, just these other swords never really existed. They were just very slightly different, and now they've fallen out of use by the time Guild Wars 2's come around. But then ArenaNet have gone and complicated it a little bit by giving players who have played Guild Wars 1 and earned Hall of Monuments points, they've given these players fiery dragon swords of their own. So there will be more fiery dragon swords in the game. I guess the question we're all asking is, will these fiery dragon swords we get from the Hall of Monuments look different to the fiery dragon sword or Mad Gale or Sahothin that we see in the dungeon storyline and with Ritlock? So it's curious. I'm wondering what the actual lore there is, whether they're going to establish an actual lore reason why these two very powerful swords look very similar to a lot of other swords we've found. And in fact, while they're at it, they could just give us some lore about the fiery dragon swords in the first place. These are obviously really cool swords that are sculpted in the form of dragons spitting fire, but who made them? And is there any deeper lore there? Especially now that they've connected this type of sword to be something so much more important with Rurik and Adalbern. So to your question, are their swords special? Yes, their swords are special in comparison to all the other generic ones we saw in Guild Wars 1. Whether we'll get any lore that 100% defines how they're different is up in the air at the moment, but I hope they do, because they've complicated this somewhat here and it needs to have some light shed on it. And a few people have asked in interviews, but I don't think that they've really explained. The next question was asked by Jaggy, who said, I was in the Temple of Ages today, and I happened to read an inscription for the statue of Melandru. The story on it tells of a tribe that was converted from humans to plant creatures. It reads, from their limbs sprouted branches, and the blood in their veins was the sap of trees. Then was Ewan and his tribe converted, and became they stewards of nature. Scriptures of Melandru, 48 BE. I was wondering if you think this is the possible origin or connection to the Silvari. I'm not sure where 48 BE fits into everything. Also, what's the Exodus? Okay, so really I'm picking this question for the last bit, but I will go into this idea with the Silvari. You could say, yes, this could have something to do with the Silvari. You could say that Melandru in some way has got some connection with that race that goes a long, long, long way back. Like maybe when the previous cycle of Silvari was alive, Melandru had some part to play in that. But this is all speculation at the moment. This is one of the great things you can look at, though, that's established in Guild Wars lore and point to if you are a believer in that theory that Melandru's got something to do with it, and say, hey, look, this is kind of similar. So that is something people do point to, and it's definitely not off the table. Melandru could have had a hand in the creation of the Silvari, and in fact one of the concept arts of the Pale Tree, you can see reflected in the waters beneath the Pale Tree the image of what looks to be a god. Now a lot of people say that's Dwayne, but I've heard a lot of people say that could be Melandru as well, and in that case that also supports that same theory. So you might be onto something there, but we don't know at the moment. But that is definitely one of the most compelling things we've heard in the scriptures of Melandru. Now you're asking what the Exodus is. Time in Guild Wars is measured differently depending on what continent you're on, but in general the main continent, if you will, the continent that was released for Guild Wars 1 at launch and the continent we'll be playing on in Guild Wars 2, the Tyrian continent, Tyria being the name of the continent and the world, by the way. Some people were a little bit confused by that. Yes, it is the same name, and yes, it doesn't make much sense considering where the humans originally came from, but I won't get too off topic. Time here on Tyria is measured by something called the Movellian calendar, and that marks year 0 0 as being the year of the Exodus. So you are either counting in the years before the Exodus, which are marked by BE. So what you say here in the question, apparently this happened 48 years before the Exodus. And if you are talking about time after the Exodus, you call it AE. So Guild Wars 1 started in 1070 years after the Exodus, and present day in Guild Wars 2 is 1325 years after the Exodus. Okay, so the question is now, what is the Exodus? Why did the people here count time around this thing? The Exodus was an event that is very significant in the gods' role over Tyria. I've noticed this a bit while talking about the story of the gods on Guild Wars 2 Daily, that it can be a bit confusing to really establish what the timeline of everything that happened with the gods is, because there seem to be several occasions where the gods left the world. But this is what the Exodus is. This is the original time they left the world. Now, what happened was the gods found Tyria and started shaping it in their own image, however they wanted to. And during this period of time, when they brought the humans, when they brought the Forgotten, or when all that stuff happened, they lived on Tyria. Now, there was a year, this thing called Year 0, when the Exodus occurred. And this is essentially when the gods decided that they were going to leave physically, in their physical manifestations, when they lived at Ara in Ur, and humans used to patrol outside of Balthazar in his courts, and they actually lived there and interacted in physical form with the humans. The Exodus is when they stopped doing that, when they moved out of Ara, and the Orions were left with this holy city that was abandoned by the gods, and they kept it clean, and they tried to keep it in the same way it was when the gods lived there, in the hopes that one day the gods might return. Now, the reason why the gods left during this event called the Exodus was because they were at war with another god called Abaddon, who decided to give the racist magic. This is a huge story, and essentially you can attribute all the events of prophecies, factions, and Nightfall down to this, and the conclusion of this really comes at the end of Nightfall. Also, at the end of Nightfall, you may recall, there is another event where the gods try to leave. See, when they leave in physical form at this point called the Exodus, they don't stop interacting with the world of Tyria. They continue to send avatars down, and they continue to give humans blessings and wisdom, and they continue to interact in some way. However, that then ends. It's what I personally have always called in my own head the second Exodus. That ends at the end of Nightfall, when Cormyr usurps Abaddon, takes his power, and she becomes a god. And it's at that point that the gods decide, right, we are leaving Tyria, we are stepping back. And also, by coincidence perhaps, or maybe not, that is also the same time when the Elder Dragons begin to rise. And this is really because those two events occur together why a lot of people create these theories between the Elder Dragons and the gods being connected in some way. But to answer your question, what is the Exodus? This is when the gods originally stopped living in physical form on Tyria. There was another event where they also left as well that can confuse things a little bit if you're not 100% familiar with the story, but hopefully that makes sense to you guys now. And that's what the Exodus is. And ever since the Exodus occurred, humans that lived in that general area on Tyria, because the gods lived in Ara, which is in Tyria, ever since that time, all of the humans up there have really counted time from that date. Humans in Nightfall count time from a completely different date, and humans in factions count time from another different date. But those are different stories about different continents that won't be so relevant for the launch of Guild Wars 2, because we're not going to be on those continents just yet at launch. But maybe eventually that'll be something that I'll be sitting here answering for you guys on Guild Wars 2 Daily. But anyway, there we go, guys. Thanks very much for watching. You can find a link to DMOsification's channel down in the description below if you want to check out some of their other stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I guess I'll see you for mechanics tomorrow. See you later.